Thanks to all of you for coming, and also a special thanks to the Carnegie Corporation, the Luce Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Janet Ross, Hal Newman. We wouldn't be here without all of your help, so thanks. Very quickly, this is a rather unusual group that came together a little over 3 years ago, and we had just sort of written the drafts of our first report when President Trump got elected. And of course, that threw everything into a very different sort of cast. And since then, I think many of us have felt that we've come to the end of a certain period of policy history where all of the assumptions that sort of underlay the ways in which we had approached China begged a reformatting. And what's been so nice about this group, which is now 17 of us, and we've met frequently in a very collegial environment, is that I think we realized we too didn't know what the answers were. And having been to Washington, which I'll say a few things about in a moment, I think even in Washington they don't know what the answers are. So this is an inflection point where we're changing course, and it is not clear to anybody really exactly what that course should be. If engagement, such as it is come to something of an end, what's the replacement? So this was the discussion we had. The reports you have are the conclusions we came to, but I have to say that at times like this, it's very hard to be certain of what you conclude. In Washington, we were there, Susan and I, with the other group of members of our task force from Washington for 2 days, just got back last night. We find the same kind of casting about, what's the right mix between confronting China and accommodating China. And that is exactly the wager that we're here to discuss today. I think the takeaways from Washington for us are that, in a strange way, there is more openness in the bureaucracy. We went to met with Senate staff members, with Rubio's staff members, with congressional staff members. We briefed the National Security Council, State Department, National Intelligence Council, had a meeting at Brookings. And it isn't as though people are arguing about a set block of policies. This is the right policy, that is the right policy. People are really discussing the proper mix. And even when you get into the sort of high levels of intelligence in Washington, they too are wondering what's going on in the upper reaches of the leadership of China. It is not clear to anyone. Thus, the future is rather uncertain. And I think it's also fair to say the future is quite fraught. So with those few preliminary remarks, it's been an enormous privilege and a great pleasure to work with all of my colleagues. And let me turn it over to my co-chair, with whom I've worked extremely well and have come to love dearly, Susan Shirk, and to give you a couple of highlights in a general sense, and then we'll have some of our other members talk specifically about areas of the report.
Well, thank you, Orville. Really, the goal of our report is to stimulate this kind of debate, which we think is needed at this point in time. The group concludes that Chinese government's recent policies and actions are increasingly at odds with the rules-based global order and with the interests and values of the United States. So, and we emphasize, despite what China's official media is saying today, that this is not just a matter of China's growing strength, economic, military, diplomatic strength, but it's a matter of the specific choices that China's decision makers have made over the past decade. In particular, on the economy, Chinese mercantilist zero-sum policies that advantage Chinese firms at the expense of international competitors in order to build their national strength, especially their very lavishly funded state-led effort to build China into a high-tech superpower. And one of the explicit objectives of that effort is to strengthen China's military capabilities. Foreign policy. Chinese government engendered doubts about its intentions, its peaceful intentions, with assertive efforts to consolidate its expansive claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea. And this harmed the legitimate interests of and legal interests of other claimants, aggravated, created a lot of tension with its neighbors. Chinese government also has been encroaching on Hong Kong autonomy and using pressure tactics on Taiwan. And there are these worldwide efforts to claim discourse power by using sometimes covert and intrusive methods, and in fact targeting overseas Chinese and other foreign groups to get them to endorse the positions of the Chinese party state. Domestically, the third big problem is that domestically China has become much more authoritarian and repressive. Xi Jinping has revived personalistic autocratic rule, tightened control over information and civil society, and of course the re-education camps for Muslims in Xinjiang are one of the most egregious examples, as well as arrests of rights lawyers and the persecution of Christian congregations. Now, although these negative trends started earlier, actually, in the second term of Hu Jintao, they've become much more serious under Xi Jinping. So, across multiple domains, Xi Jinping and his associates are enacting policies that are putting China's long-held aspiration to rise peacefully in a stable international environment, they're putting that at risk. And it's provoking a widespread backlash, and it's not just coming from the Trump administration, not just coming from Democrats and Republicans as one of those rare points of bipartisan agreement in Congress, but it's also coming from other advanced industrial countries. It's really very broad-based around the world. So what we try to figure out is what is the best way of handling this challenge. And we argue that it's time for a course correction to alter the mix of cooperation and pressure to more strongly emphasize pressure and deterrence. That means publicly calling out China's unfair ideological and assertive policies and pushing back harder against them. So the Trump administration got this part right. But we believe, and this is really the main point of our report, that pushback alone isn't actually a strategy that's going to get the Chinese government to alter, to modify its policies in a way, to make the specific changes that we seek. So we propose an alternative called smart competition. That means building on China's strengths to compete effectively with China. It's tougher, but
our strengths, right? America's strengths.
Yes, building on America's strengths to compete effectively with China. So smart competition means building international coalitions of allies and friends to press China's leaders to follow international laws and norms. What it doesn't mean is going it alone and alienating friends and allies. What it does mean is preserving and updating international institutions that enhance our influence on China. It doesn't mean abdicating from those institutions or trying to weaken them. So, and smart competition also means seeking to negotiate priority disputes with Beijing by laying out concrete measures that China could take in order to restore better relations with the United States. So that means a clear set of achievable demands. You know, when we talked about this in Washington, I was kind of embarrassed to be talking to my friends and colleagues in the government. This is like diplomacy 101. It's not rocket science. This is just normal negotiating practices. So, but we really think we need to say this now, emphasize this, because we need to test China's flexibility on these issues. One issue that we discussed a lot in our group is to what extent Chinese government's overreaching, if you will, its more ideological, assertive policies, its more self-interested, mercantilist policies, to what extent are they hard-baked into Leninist one-party rule, Chinese style? Or is there still this pragmatic gene that China's leaders used to have that still exists? In other words, are they willing to make adjustments, make compromises in order to reduce the costs that they're now experiencing internationally because of this broad backlash? The only way we'll know that is by making a good faith effort to negotiate. If we don't, there's no way to get that information. We need that information to keep updating our strategy. If there's no flexibility, then we need to head in one direction. If there is flexibility, then we need to proceed with carrots and sticks and try to solve problems. And also, as China hands, we want to emphasize that China is not monolithic. There's a lot more diversity of viewpoints than you would realize. And the internal economic and political situation is not likely to be a straight line from the present. So what we don't want to do is lock ourselves into an implacably hostile stance vis-a-vis China now in a way that would preclude future cooperation. And we also believe we have to keep advocating for our democratic values because there are plenty of people in China who still hold them and hope to see that in the future. Then we have a few cautions that I'll just very briefly touch on. We want to right-size the China threat, to really understand what it is and not inflate it, but pursue solutions that effectively address it without undercutting the vitality of the American system or our alliances or our economic well-being. So what this means is we have to strike a balance between protecting national security and preserving our own open society, and not overreact to the perceived China threat with self-defeating measures and exclusionary measures that will, for one thing, cause us to lose the competition for talent around the world. I really believe that competition and attracting Chinese talent to America is one of our greatest advantages. So if we pursue really too expansive a definition of what are the technologies we need to protect in America, our advantages, we'll lose our competitive advantages by driving Chinese talent out of the United States. And we could inadvertently also trigger an anti-Chinese Red Scare that puts all Chinese people, including those of Chinese heritage, under a shadow of suspicion in America. So in other words, we urge, let's not get into a race to the bottom with China, of protectionism, of exclusion, and let's be a better version of ourselves rather than becoming more like China. So we hope that this report stimulates debate and everybody calms down a little bit and thinks about costs and benefits and makes good policies to manage the China challenge in the future.
Good. Thank you, Susan. Now, I think, Tom, you were next, or?
I think it's economics.
All right, let's then go to, do you want to start, Art? And then we'll turn to trade for
Dan. Okay, so I will give a brief summary of the key recommendations of the report on economic policy, and then I think Dan Rosen will follow up with a little bit of discussion of how this relates to the ongoing commercial negotiations that we have with China. So I think the key points that we make in the report are, first of all, defining overall U.S. interests in the China relationship, and at the highest level, what we want as a country is, first of all, a liberal, rules-based political and economic order that as many countries as possible participate in. And then within that, a fair and market-based global economic system, again, with maximum participation. A peaceful and stable Asia-Pacific, and a stable and productive relationship with China. So the first observation is that if you think of American interests from that perspective, the policy of constructive engagement that we had from the 1970s until quite recently was actually quite successful in delivering all of these. So I think one of our starting points is that while we do clearly think that there's a need for an updated and corrected U.S. policy, this does not involve a repudiation of what was done before. And as Susan mentioned, the big reason why we need to make a significant course correction in policy is that the Chinese government in the last several years has elected to follow policies in the economic realm, which I'm addressing here, that are essentially corrosive of fair competition and the liberal, rules-based global economic order that we would like to preserve. So I think the key point is not that China is strong and that the U.S. is nervous about that, but that China has made specific policy decisions and choices that undermine the overall kind of economic system that we think is beneficial, not just for the United States, but for everyone in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. So how do we address this issue? The core of our economic recommendations you'll find at the bottom of page 17 and the top of page 18 of our report. It basically boils down to three broad principles. First of all, we think that U.S. policy, economic policy towards China should be organized around the concept of fair competition. So, in other words, let's not focus on trade deficits or particular issues that we might have, but let's try and make sure that there is a fair, competitive framework for both U.S. companies and Chinese companies to operate under. And we have something quite specific in mind when we talk about fair competition, which you'll find at the top of page 18. There are really two components to it. One of them is national treatment, and what this means is that any country should treat foreign goods, foreign services, foreign intellectual property the same way that they would treat domestically produced versions of these things. So there's no discrimination based on the origin of products or services or property. And the second a key component of fairness is reciprocity, which means that you treat companies from another country as well as that country treats your companies when they operate in their domains. And I think it's quite clear that Chinese policy at present falls short, significantly short on both of these things. There are clear industrial policies under Made in China 2025 which seem constructed to discriminate in favor of domestic firms and against foreign firms, and to discriminate in favor of domestically produced goods and technologies at the expense of internationally produced goods and technologies. And it's also very clear that China expects the world to be open to it and to its companies, and that its companies should have a free hand to invest and trade wherever they want, which is fine, except that they're not willing to extend reciprocal openness to foreign companies to participate in the Chinese economy, either through market access or through the ability to acquire assets or open businesses without onerous government restrictions. So both on the grounds of national treatment and reciprocity, it is very, very clear that the Chinese economy falls well short of what we would consider to be a basic standard of fair competition. So that's the first principle. The second, and Susan made some reference to this already, is that while we do need to pay attention to legitimate national security concerns, we are concerned that national security logic, which is by definition zero-sum, should not be applied indiscriminately in the economic realm, where the goal should be to find positive-sum solutions that provide some benefit to everyone. When it comes to things like investment restrictions, export controls, and other restrictions on Chinese economic activity in the United States or with U.S. Commercial partners, we should indeed, where national security is genuinely implicated, we should work to protect U.S. interests. But we should not use national security as an excuse to really put in jeopardy the highly productive commercial and technological relationships that exist at many levels between Chinese, American, and other international firms. And we think that basically if you have a clearly defined a set of fair competition rules that everyone actually observes, that this will address a lot of the underlying issues that the national security inflected approach of the Trump administration is now trying to address. And third, beyond fair competition and an appropriate and carefully calibrated national security test, we think it's really important to work with partner countries, because the objective here is not to engage in a one-on-one competition with China. The objective here is to create a global system of fair competition and economic relationships that companies from China, from the U.S., and from other countries can all participate in and profit from. And to the degree that this system is being undermined by Chinese policy choices, you have a lot better chance of constraining those policy choices and making the Chinese think twice if you present them with an alliance of like-minded countries that can together articulate their concern for how Chinese policies undermine the rules of a fair global trading system. So those are, I think, the general principles that we try to articulate in our economic section. I think Dan Rosen can supplement that with a couple more specific comments.
Thank you, Arthur, and to Orville and Susan for inviting me to join this task force. I wasn't part of the first round. Very proud to be part of this second round that we released today. So I'm going to walk what Arthur put on the table over to sort of how we apply that. How is this practically useful in this moment today? And let me note that along with Arthur and myself, Barry Naughton was the third sort of co-chair for the economic section of the report. He played a critical role in helping to put it together. Yeah? And Charlene Barshevsky, excuse me. So I want to talk just super quick, a couple minutes, 4 elements that I think are critical to be in any U.S. China negotiated framework or outcome that we might have in this season. The first of those is a meaningful, substantial understanding between the two sides on what structural reform means and needs to consist of. That there needs to be an acknowledgement on the Chinese side of how much legitimate requirement for structural adjustment in China and policy reform in China there is in Washington and almost all other market economies today as well. The simple hard truth, which there is some discussion of in the report, is that there's no use pretending that engagement can be sustained, as we've previously used the word, if China is choosing not to be convergent with how we run our systems and economies and the advanced economies. If they're not interested in that, then we come up with a different approach to our relationship, and that's okay. We oughtn't call that failure. It can't be called failure. We just have to acknowledge it, deal with it, and move on to whatever comes next. But that engagement is somewhat contingent on China's interest in being a structurally reform-oriented economy. Secondly, in any outcome, there needs to be a down payment of some sort, because so much goodwill has been lost in recent years, as we've mentioned up here, and as is reviewed briefly in the report. That down payment is the key to unlocking a sense of fairness in this moment, which is important to economists. It's even more important to politicians today, because it's very easy to make hay out of the appearance of a lack of fairness in a relationship, right? And we see that happening all over the world right now. So there, regardless of what economists want to say about long-term welfare, if it doesn't look fair, if it doesn't smell fair, if it doesn't walk fair, it ain't fair right now. So that's super important. And it's not just a superficiality, but there needs to be a down payment of some sort in any kind of outcome right now that demonstrates a return to this principle of fairness. Thirdly, there needs to be, and this is not so much in the report again, but my application of it to the current moment, safeguards and some transitional arrangements. That's different from enforcement and verification, which I'm going to come to in a second. Transitional and safeguard mechanisms mean that it's ridiculous and immature to think that China can deliver anything structural, meaningful overnight, or even inside 1 year or one American political cycle. It's going to take time. Therefore, rather than taking everything on faith, the two sides need to accept the reinstitution of transitional mechanisms that can provide for time for China to take all the time it needs to do the structural work it needs to, but take the burden entirely off our shoulders of tolerating the disadvantageous implications of their non-market homework that needs to be done in the interim. So transitional mechanisms are going to need to be part of the mix, whether that's keeping a fairly significant amount of tariffs in place until China delivers the promised benefits to us and other countries, or what have you, we can discuss. And finally, enforcement and verification, as everyone's talking about today. This is about addressing the inherent uncertainty about China's long-term willingness to implement a more liberal, and I use the word pointedly, economic policy package, but not just their willingness and interest, their ability to do so, given the special context and challenges of the Chinese system and situation and realities today. It's not entirely clear that even if reform-oriented folks want to implement an adequately like-minded convergent policy package, they'll be able to do so. So there will very much need to be an agreed framework for monitoring, observing their progress toward our goals. Asia Society has the one that Tom Nagorski mentioned at the outset that we do in partnership together called China Dashboard, trying to operationalize, as we say, what structural adjustment really needs to look like, so we can do more than just our gut feeling of whether we think they're doing it or not. That's probably the right way to go. We stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Tom?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Orville. I just wanted to say that it's such a privilege to be involved in this project for this round and the previous round, and I really congratulate Orville and Susan for herding the cats necessary to put this together into a consensus document. It's not an easy process, and they're just terrific at it. I worked in the security section, and I can't really represent the views of everybody in that section, but I'll do my best to lay out some of the some of the findings of that section as best I can. So we outline challenges to the United States and its allies in East Asia. The two biggest challenges are the dramatic military modernization that China's been undergoing and the implications for the United States and its allies, particularly in the first island chain closest to China. And the second challenge is more behavioral. It's about China's assertive pursuit of its long-held sovereignty claims in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, and in the East China Sea that pose real challenges, again, for the United States and for its regional allies and partners. In the South China Sea, I'll start there. The threat is posed by a combination of China's construction of military-capable artificial islands, its unwillingness to clarify its long-held claims in a way that's consistent with international law, and the increased presence of Chinese military and maritime law enforcement ships and planes in the region that challenge the interests of other disputants in that South China Sea, in the South China Sea. An important moment was the rejection of the 2016 International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea ruling, and that outright rejection by China underscores a lot of the security problems in that region. Our recommendations are that the United States should not get involved in the sovereignty disputes, as some in Washington have suggested recently, taking sides in the sovereignty disputes. But the United States needs to demonstrate that it will exercise its legal rights and will not be deterred from exercising its legal rights in the South China Sea. And that means vigorous and frequent freedom of navigation operations to demonstrate the limits of China's claims, even if they were recognized as China's claims. And that should be done by the United States and like-minded states. It should be done more frequently than it was done in previous administrations, but it should be done quietly. There's no reason to talk about this in public. The Chinese will notice you're doing it, and our allies can be told if they don't notice themselves. So frequent and quiet freedom of navigation operations. A second item is more public and more dramatic joint warfighting exercises in the region to demonstrate certain skills that the U.S. military has that other militaries, including China's, do not. These are necessary because despite the complaints of the Chinese government, freedom of navigation operations are not very dramatic military exercises. They tend to just demonstrate presence. They don't demonstrate much else. So I think we should less frequently, but more publicly, also have some joint warfighting exercises to demonstrate American military strength in the region. So that's the South China Sea. The questions with Taiwan and cross-strait relations, we believe the United States needs to work hard to encourage the strengthening of Taiwan's defense capabilities against the two big challenges that face Taiwan moving into the future. One is often talked about, and that is the threat of invasion from mainland China, and the other is blockade. Invasion, Taiwan can raise various measures, and I can talk about those in the Q&A, that will make an already difficult to invade island much more difficult to invade at relatively reasonable costs. Blockade is tougher still, and there are many things that Taiwan really needs to do that it hasn't done in the past to make blockade much less likely to be successful as a coercive tool against Taiwan. At the same time that we encourage strengthening the Taiwan's defense sector, we also point out that the United States needs to maintain its traditional One China policy. We should avoid political initiatives that seem symbolically supportive of Taiwan, but do little for actual strengthening of Taiwan, and actually could cause huge problems for Taiwan because they might provoke destabilizing reactions on the mainland. And I can't speak for my co-authors in the security section, but I think most of them, if not all of them, would agree with me when I say a speech by President Tsai to a joint session of Congress would be just such a symbolic act that would do nothing for the strengthening of Taiwan and would endanger Taiwan given the likely reaction on the mainland. This is something that I sum up in my own talks as saying that everybody in the United States loves Taiwan. Some people want to love Taiwan to death. The East China Sea, it's pretty straightforward. The United States should strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance in response to China's military modernization and also the pressure it's putting on the Senkaku Islands, which China disputes with Japan, and continue to reassert the long-held position of the United States that the U.S.-Japan alliance applies to the administrative control of Japan over those islands. We have some general prescriptions. And this is an important one, and it's when we talk about course correction. The United States should emphasize its greatest competitive advantage over China, and it can't be overstated. And that is that the United States has 60-plus allies and security partners around the world. China has North Korea. Right, that's the comparison. When the United States takes actions that undercut the strength of our alliances and our partnerships around the world, we are scoring an own goal that only helps China's relative rise vis-a-vis the United States. So we should put more emphasis on those alliance relationships and on those security partnerships. And then in the technology field, there are security implications to some of the technology competition with China, in particular 5G telecommunications and artificial intelligence. I agree with my colleagues on the economic section that this type of competition shouldn't spread to all sectors of technology or non-technological sectors of the economy. Decoupling is unrealistic, but we're probably going to try to decouple in certain areas of technology for national security reasons, but we have to do more than just complain. This is an American problem. We have to do more than just complain about China's development of 5G and AI and special relationships related to them around the world. We need to develop our own. And we need to invest in 5G and artificial intelligence in a major way in a national effort so that the United States will be more competitive in that aspect of the competition with China as well. I've probably spoken for too long. There are other things we can talk about related to security affairs with China, and I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Tom. So now we come to Winston, who's going to talk about the question of Chinese influence-seeking and human rights.
Thank you, Orville, and I would like to echo my colleagues' praise of our co-chairs and the terrific job they do in steering this process. The cliche when you get to the last speaker is, I'm the last person between you and lunch. In this case, I'm the last person between you and your questions. So I will try to be as brief as possible in covering two important sections of the report. We have a traditional issue, human rights, and a relatively new issue, Chinese influence overseas, and they're related because abuses on the Chinese mainland are now being exported to other societies. Let me take human rights first. Under Xi in particular, repression of human rights, always a problem, has greatly intensified, and our report highlights some recent glaring examples, from persecution of an individual to ethnic and religious cleansing of millions of individuals, from intensified attacks on Western values to new menacing technology for surveillance. Not only are outside efforts to improve this situation less effective, they are less, period, including with the Trump administration ignoring this issue almost completely in China, indeed everywhere in the world. Now, there are classic debates always when you fashion foreign policy of how much do you pay attention to human rights versus other interests, and how effective can you be? Clearly, in the case of China, as this report makes clear, our security, economic, and geopolitical issues top the agenda. But despite the bleak prospects in this area, we do advocate promoting human rights and democracy for several reasons spelled out in the report, including an expression of our values, maintaining domestic support for our policy, encouraging reformers in China. But this is important. It also reflects concrete American national interests. This is not just values, it's interests as well. And we make 11 recommendations. I don't have time to go into them, both for the U.S. government and for civil society, using various platforms and vehicles to promote these causes. with multilateral emphasis being key. It's much more effective if we're joined by others. Secondly, the issue of overseas influence. Now, you can debate the relevance and the effectiveness of promoting one's values in other societies, but I submit you can't debate the need to defend those values at home. In recent years, there's been greatly intensified Chinese government and party campaign in the U.S. and elsewhere to influence views by promoting Chinese positions or have those views adopt Chinese perspectives and blocking and pressuring the expression of contrary perspectives. Now, this new issue is rising in our Congress and universities, think tanks, media, and so on, and its most comprehensive treatment was in a previous report of a subcommittee of this group on Chinese influence overseas. It was issued by the Hoover Institute and Asia Society in late November, entitled Chinese Influence in American Interests, Promoting Constructive Vigilance. In that report and in this one, we point out that only Russia comes close to matching China's efforts. China's not trying to destroy our system like Russia is, but in terms of comprehensiveness of efforts in various areas, China exceeds Russia in many respects. Now, again, in this report, as in that previous one, we are meticulous in distinguishing between legitimate public diplomacy by China, the kind of things that we and other countries do, whether it's exchanges or visitor programs or public lobbying of governments. And we try to point out those which are illegitimate in our views, roughly under the headings of being covert, corrupt, or coercive, and that these require some proactive American responses. We're also clear, as Susan pointed out, not to stigmatize people of Chinese heritage, Chinese citizens or Chinese Americans. We're very clear about that. The report highlights many specific Chinese actions, again, I don't have time to go into them, which occur in other countries as well as the U.S. and which violate sovereignty. They range from kidnapping Chinese in Taiwan and other citizens in Hong Kong and other countries, to buying politicians in Australia, to physically threatening scholars in New Zealand, from attempts to censor or influence the agendas covertly in American institutions, universities, and think tanks, to punishing companies and NGOs that offend China, to pressuring against the views of Chinese students in America, to the total lack of reciprocity between Chinese access to our society and ours to China's society, whether it's the media, scholarly pursuits, or culture. And in this report, we lay out recommendations, and the principles include promoting transparency, what is China up to, careful diligence and oversight of Chinese activities in American institutions, educating various civil institutions, including NGOs and universities and think tanks about Chinese methods, and promoting solidarity and response. And with respect to the lack of reciprocity, the uneven playing fields, employing selective retaliation to gain Chinese attention without overdoing it, for example, in visa policy. Let me close on a personal note. This does not reflect the group as a whole necessarily. But I believe both in promoting human rights in China and pursuing constructive vigilance in America, our highest priority is to strengthen our values here at home. Democratic principles are under siege in many parts of the world, and the current American administration is not just ignoring this trend, it's fostering it. It's favoring authoritarianism overseas and eroding democracy at home. Until we return to traditional American standards, we will face even greater obstacles in furthering human rights in China and fortifying them in America. Only getting back on our democratic course will fully enable us to engage in smart competition over ideas and values. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Winston. One thing that was very clear to Susan and I in Washington was that despite the fact that our own country is riven by a tremendous amount of disputation between Republicans and Democrats, when it comes to China, we now have a bipartisan issue. And that is both, I think, provides something of an opportunity, but it also can be a little bit frightening when all of Washington gets running in the same direction. Now, that has happened precisely because I think the point that Susan made about that gene that at one point coded for pragmatism in China, is it still there? Can it still express itself? Before we throw it open to you for questions, I'd like to just put that question to the panel, and not everybody has to answer, and to you too. Do we still think it is possible that China could respond in a constructive, rational way to reinforce those places where we do have common interest at this moment when they are actually a little off balance because the Trump administration has challenged them? In other words, is that a real possibility, or is it a fool's errand? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
The quick answer is if everybody follows every line of our report, we'll be able to succeed. I think the answer is yes, but it's obviously going to rest on the principle that always guides Chinese foreign policy, in fact, most countries, self-interest. So we got to find a way through the proper mix of carrots and sticks to bring home to China its self-interest in adhering to a more, quote, liberal international order, which has served China as well. It's enabled it to rise and to show that there are areas we can cooperate on. And that is why, in response to this rather menacing trend in Chinese policy, we're very careful not only to show where we push back, but where we seek out concretely and pragmatically to find this pragmatic gene again. I think since it's in their self-interest in many respects, it's still there, but it's going to be difficult given Mr. Xi and his policies to exploit it, but I think it's possible.
Art?
Yeah, we had a fair amount of discussion on this topic in the economic group, and I think one of the points that we largely agreed on is that, it's very important for U.S. policy to proceed in the first instance on the assumption that pragmatism can be elicited, and so we need to work in that direction. But we also need to have in place mechanisms so that if that pragmatism doesn't emerge, we're still in an okay position. And this is why it's so important to work with partners, particularly through mechanisms like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think pretty much everyone agreed it was a huge mistake for the U.S. to get out of that, precisely for the reason that creates a mechanism with enormous economic benefits for those who participate in it. It sets a very high standard on precisely the issues that are concerning to us in Chinese behavior, such as subsidies, state-owned enterprises, technology transfer, and so forth. And it's if China chooses to join that would be a pragmatic decision that would serve our interests. But equally, if they choose not to join it because the cost would be too high, we still have a high standard agreement that will be extremely beneficial for us and for all of the other many countries who would be involved in that. So that's a good template for thinking how we should approach this. Yes, try to elicit that pragmatism, but have in place mechanisms that you develop with your allies that provide a hedge against China deciding to go its own way.
Okay, let's have some questions from you all. Let's keep them brief. Identify yourself and please. Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Yifei Chang. I have two questions related. One is that this report sounds very interesting, lots of good arguments. My question is whether you or the study group ever considered, since the accommodation policy seems to be working as you stated, whether the China policy or U.S. policy on the China side, which side is reactionary or both are reactionary? Have you considered that as a basis for all these discussions? That's number one question. Secondly, I think, as
let's just do one question because our poor simple brains can't absorb two at once.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who would like to take
I'm
a?
not sure what that means.
I think what he's saying. Yeah, Dan, if you.
Whenever there's a sea change in the strategic landscape, the doctrine even of engagement of whether the same sense of self-interest are still effective, given all the changes that have taken place. Whenever there's this large a magnitude change among great powers, there's going to be debate about who toppled the apple cart over. Where did this arise from? Which is revisionist, which is not. As much as possible in the report, we've tried to be very objective and pragmatic about what is changing in the relationship. And that is indeed one of our first observations in the way we've structured the assessment here, that we can identify and describe fundamental changes in the emphasis in the Chinese system in terms of the way the economy works, which of course is the fattest pipeline in which we have interaction together as two countries, but also in terms of how the politics is trending and what the overarching goals are of the party with regard to society and how it works. There are major, I would say, hopefully superficial changes in the way the United States is operating as well. I don't believe them to be irreversible yet. I think the profundity of the changes we're observing on the Chinese side are much different, in fact, and even our Chinese friends engage with us in conversation about just how portentous they are if they cannot be course corrected and reversed. So I think that's the view we take, that yes, there's a lot of change on both sides, but that the nature of the changes we observe on the Chinese side are the fundamental driver of what's happening in the dynamics here.
I'd like to say something if I could. I've been upset about the way the term engagement has been described in Washington discussions recently, and the question suggested that that was the definition of engagement that was being offered, which is that engagement policy towards China was just accommodation. That was never the case in the George H.W. Bush administration, in the Clinton administration, in the Bush administration, or in the Obama administration, and that's become the narrative in Washington in large part because of some relatively prominent voices who have been attacking the engagement policy as a failure. Engagement was always a mix of seeking cooperation with deterrence. The Clinton administration sent 2 carrier battle groups to the area around Taiwan, to WTO cases against Chinese violations of international market principles. It was always a mix of those things. And what we're calling for in the report is an adjustment in that mix. We're not rejecting engagement as a failure. And I guess I would maybe dissent from a couple of the verbal comments that were made here today. Engagement hasn't reached a dead end. The basic engagement policy is still there. There's really not a replacement for it. And no one has, within the mainstream of American discussions of these things, suggested anything that's fundamentally different from what was there before. So very few people have recommended breaking diplomatic contacts with China or trying to find common ground with China on issues like Iran and North Korea. Very few people have talked about totally separating the United States economy from the Chinese economy. So engagement's gotten a bad name because of a bad definition. And I think we need to sustain the traditional definition of what engagement meant, lest we throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Change the mix right here.
TK Chang from Zhonglin Law Firm. Before coming to the meeting, I looked at how the major media have summarized the report. Financial Times says that you have endorsed Trump's tough approach on trade. The New York Times emphasized multilateral institutions, and the South China Morning Post says the U.S. must use all military and diplomatic means to defend Taiwan. So it's almost like they're reading different reports. So that could be a limitation of journalism. I just wondered who got it right and what is the main thrust of the report so that it's more likely to be translated into policy action.
Well, let me try to dispatch that one quickly. I think we do agree that the Trump administration, by being more resistant to China, has gotten their attention. And that's a good thing. We also believe there's some lacunae in his policy, namely, as Susan pointed out, and Tom, our alliance structure is important, and there are many other things that we think with global governance that the United States has to be present in this, because nature abhors a vacuum, and China is going to rush in, and they are. So I think that part of it is right, and part of it needs some fixing. And thus, and I'm sorry, even though I'm a lowly scribe myself, I can't take responsibility for the international journalism.
Hi, Rory Daniels, National Committee on American Foreign Policy. I found myself nodding along with many of your comments today. I think the strategy that you've laid out is indeed smart and smart competition, but it seems very fundamentally incompatible with our own president's ideology. So I'm wondering what you think is possible in the next 2 or possibly 6 years. Is a smart strategy towards China to wait out this strain of American foreign policy ideology, or do we need to adapt some of these recommendations to better fit what the president wants to do on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, we made a conscious choice not to spend a huge amount of time critiquing all the things that we're critical of about the Trump administration, but to lay out a better alternative. And that we hope that this, who knows, we brief folks within the administration. There are a lot of smart people left in the a few smart people left in the Trump administration. And, and they really take what we say seriously. They certainly took our first report quite seriously. So we can't predict how that will work out. But we're thinking about the long term. And this is what I've said when I'm in China, too, speaking to the Chinese side. Don't try to game out your dealings with the Trump administration to try to figure out what's in our president's mind and what his bottom line is and what he'll do in the next 90 days. Instead, think about your long-term problem that you're facing now, this backlash around the world, and how you might want to consider making adjustments in your policy to reduce that backlash, which is costly to you. It's costly to you in restricting your investments. It's causing a tremendous backlash against Huawei around the world. So, it would make sense to think about this in the long term. And that's the way we're thinking about it.
If I could just add, I am not an inveterate Washington goer, and I've never served in the government. But I've been extraordinarily impressed over the last few years, and we've made many trips to Washington, particularly the last 2 days, by the number of actually smart, able, dedicated people there are in the U.S. government. Yeah. Whether it's in the CIA, the FBI, NIC, State Department, NSC, and we get very distracted by what goes on at the top. But the government is a giant animal that moves, most of what it does, it doesn't have anybody that shows up in the paper or on cable television. And there's a pretty good depth of field still of people who are still operating according to a system. So those are the people that we're appealing to. And I'd have to say also, paradoxically, I don't think I've ever felt more listened to in Washington than now. Maybe it's because nobody knows what to do. I don't know how you all feel.
I think you're risking becoming too optimistic. As long as we got this president with his attitude toward human rights here and abroad, his attitude toward multilateral institutions and multilateral agreements, his views of either overreaching in blunt ways or declaring fake victories which we're probably going to see on China trade and on North Korea in the coming weeks. I'm very depressed about the next couple of years. I think all we can do is to keep talking to those in the government, certainly in the Congress, where many Republicans would agree with the critiques, as well as the Democrats. Hope that some in the administration with influence. I mean, it isn't clear to me that all the top advisors want to screw up every single alliance, and there may be some modification. But I think Rory's question is an excellent one. What can we do except put out this report, keep pressing it on various constituencies, hoping that Trump is reined in by sanity and other quarters and his own self-interest. But I think right now it looks like we may see at least 2 more years, let's hope that's the maximum, of Trump making China great again.
All right, next question right here. Laura.
Hi, I'm Joan Kaufman from the Schwartzman Scholars Program, and I really want to thank you for this very sophisticated analysis. But just one thing, I've worked in China and been engaged with China for 40 years, and to see this increasing demonization of China and the various reports that have come out, there's the sophisticated analysis and the reports which actually are not demonizing China, but then there are the headlines, which are painting a picture of China that may be fair, but is fairly ugly and is speaking to the base and affecting our electoral politics and the attitudes of many Americans who don't read the sophisticated analysis. So how do we protect against that? Because for those of us, I think, who have been engaged over a long period of time, there's the high-level politics, and then there's this huge level of engagement that continues to exist in the business world, in the academic world, in other ways that it's rich, we want it to continue, and we really don't want to demonize the country and China, and we need to protect against that. So, I know Susan feels strongly about this as well. I just like to get the view of the panel on how do we protect against that as these very pragmatic and important recommendations go forward.
My meta concern in my entire life right now is that we've worked so hard to try to be diplomatic and accommodating and have one China conceptions that can accommodate everybody's different view of things. At some point, the general public starts to think it's all really fake, isn't it? Because it means whatever these high-powered intellectuals want it to mean. And at the end of the day, my interests on the ground don't change. So I fear, I fear that we actually have to strip away some of the diplomacy at present to have a more fundamental discussion around the nature of our relationship, what engagement needs to include to be effective and foundational. On that term, I have a commentary, not a dissent, but a commentary at the end of the report, elaborating how I see, because that's such a heavy word right now. How I see it a little differently maybe than Tom and some of my other colleagues here too. But to be frank, disengagement's already happened, right? It's already happening. The value of Chinese direct investment into the United States has fallen by 96% over the past 2 years, right? And the trend continues in other channels of our interaction as well. So we have to acknowledge that engagement as we knew it is now over. That's either temporary or it will be enduring, but it's time to unpack what's going on and what it will take to put it back together again, rather than stand by the importance of the liturgy, I think, and just staying engaged with the constructs we've used in the past because they've been such a linchpin. They have been, but there's a danger to that we start losing too many people from the conversation who think it doesn't seem to really mean enough. That's my view. It's a little bit of a minority view, even within this task force, I think, but for what it's worth.
Well, I just want to say that I think what Dan is talking about, when we talk about engagement, we're using the word in somewhat 2 different ways here. So our first report talked about engagement from a principled position of strength. That's the way we define what our policy has been. Dan is talking mostly about economic and technological integration, right?
Well, no, I'm talking about it as the policy of the United States toward the People's Republic of China. We have had an engagement policy, which our new national security strategy has turned a corner on.
Okay.
So it's broader.
Okay, so that is the same thing. Same thing. I just want to emphasize that if we look at public opinion is a lot less negative about China than the politics are right now. So the American public, although it's become, just as the Chinese public has become somewhat more negative toward the United States, American public has become somewhat more negative toward China. There's a really good piece by Dan Dresner in the Wall Street Journal last week or the week before summarizing the survey results. But if you compare it to what politicians in Congress and the Trump administration and stuff are saying now, or maybe even what we're saying now, the public is not nearly as negative. So the demonization of China that you talk about really isn't a big problem at present among the public. The way I like to think about this now, and I do feel that in the political class, there's kind of a herding instinct and a panic underway about the China threat. So the herding instinct could take our country off a cliff. And the way I like to frame it is, let's just think about costs and benefits and how, in terms of our own interests, not just preserving a nice relationship with China. You know, I agree with Dan that if those of us who are China hands and diplomats and stuff are looking like we're kind of just protecting a notion of U.S. China relations that doesn't match the reality anymore, that's going to look fake. And it won't be credible to people. So instead, let's be realistic about the sorry state of U.S. China relations right now. But then as we think about moving forward what to do about it, let's have a dispassionate, objective conversation about what sorts of concrete policies will really be effective and not really change America in ways that will be very harmful to ourselves. Our open society, our competition for talent, our dynamic innovation ecosystem. So that's the way I like to combat the overly simplistic demonization.
Let me just quickly add, I don't want to prolong this, but it's such an important question, a very fair question, I think. It was one of the purposes of our report, not only to sketch in some detail some of the ominous trends, but also to make sure that we respond appropriately, not demonizing. There's a reason we put SMART in with competition. And SMART not only means alliances and what you do at home and multilateral institutions and specific requests in economic and other fields, but it also means SMART, don't overreact. Don't demonize, if you will. Just a few examples. We've said very clearly, don't demonize all Chinese heritage people when we're worried about Chinese influence in our society. Yes, certain investments in the security area have to be looked at, but don't discourage Chinese investment across the board in the U.S. Don't start excluding Chinese students and talent that we need in our universities. Do seek cooperation. And in the global governance section, which we haven't had a chance to explore today in any depth, we do point out many areas where China is making positive contributions, whether it's climate change, Iran, anti-piracy, anti-terrorism, as well as where they're doing more unhelpful things. So that we're trying to make the case that we shouldn't overreact and demonize. And so I think you acknowledge yourself that in the report we try to do that. The problem is if you get the wrong kind of headlines, and we're going to have to keep pressing our case in a sophisticated way, I think.
Can I say one more thing?
Just try to get maybe two more questions in, and because we have
Wang Dong from Wang Dong from the Chinese consulate in New York. Okay, we already from our part we already heard this is the hardest time in our bilateral relations, and I don't think China has any strategy or intention to conflict with the United States or change the current world order from which we benefit most. And we are doing our best to dialogue, communicate American counterparts to seek common grounds while resolving differences, including a fair trade deal and also cybersecurity talk negotiations on other regional issues. And 40 years diplomatic relations prove that our two largest countries in the world, we gain from cooperation, lose from confrontation. And it takes two to tango. So do not always blame China for everything or anything. And both sides should, at this crucial moment, both sides needed to look inside and how can we do to maintain or stabilize our relations. So one question is from my observation in recent years that, United States is now much polarized. Okay. Divided. So, and many different voices from every part of the United States, media and government, federal, local. So, and I know that you are China hand expert. I would like to listen to, and China resources is limited. How can we do better PR in the United States to to make a relation better?
I'll make one suggestion. I'll make one suggestion for you, sir. Thank you for coming this morning. You said that don't say that all the problems are on the Chinese side. We didn't do that today. We talked about a lot of problems in America. Could you please tell us some of the problems on the Chinese side? And if you can't, I think that's a problem in your... No. If you could just mention a couple from a Chinese government perspective, some problems in Chinese policy toward the United States that need to be corrected, that would be good public relations. But I don't hear very much of that.
Yes, from our part, I think we are doing something to maintain our political, social stability and make China better, people living better.
Yeah, I was asking you to criticize China's government policy toward the United States in certain ways. Yeah.
Criticize. That's public relations. Okay. So how can we do better?
Well,
through PR.
I think your question of how do we do better is at the heart of the matter. I don't think PR is going to be the answer on either side, quite frankly. I think we're beyond that. You can't just replaster the Berlin Wall and keep it up. Our relations are seriously stressed at this time, and we need some major new kind of reaccommodations. So I think it would behoove you and it behooves us to think, what can we do? I mean, Confucius always said, Xiu Shen, reflect, correct yourself first. I think that's the challenge. Okay, we have time for one more. Let's take over here.
My name is Tang Biao, scholar and human rights lawyer. In terms of flexibility, since 1989 or 1979, we have seen this again and again. Chinese Communist parties are very flexible in terms of financial or social system or legal and ideological system. They have changed a lot. But they are not flexible in terms of maintaining the one-party rule. They will not change their political system. So there is one fundamental question. So the international, China's international behavior, to what extent represents the interest of China or Chinese people or the interest of the Communist Party?
Who would like to respond to that?
The global backlash that is growing against Chinese party state, you have to ask yourself, is that actually I don't believe it's in China's national interest, for sure. You have to ask yourself, is that actually in the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, or even in the interests of Xi Jinping, the general secretary of that party? I mean, hyping external threats in a hostile environment, which we've seen in recent speeches. There's a lot of talk about crisis, risk in the environment, urgency, which is an effort to rally people around a strong leader, around the party, because there are all these, it's a very dangerous environment. And but is it actually in the interests of the party and the leader? I think we also hear Xi Jinping articulate, a lot of nice ideas about global cooperation and order and win-win and open global order. And I think there's also a yearning for international respect and status, which, of course, can be achieved through responsible behavior and working with other countries in a way that isn't so narrowly self-interested. So, I guess you could argue that this kind of more provocative behavior is somehow in the interests of the party, but it certainly is not in the interests of the nation or the society. But I'm not even sure it's in the interest of the party. Because in the long term, how can Chinese Communist Party continue to attract the support of urban middle-class people who have traveled abroad, who have, expected the party to lead them in a modern way toward a more vibrant, open market economy, and to gradually be more responsive to public needs and increase their quality of life as well as their income. And I just think there's a tremendous disconnect between what the party seems to stand for and what probably most middle-class people in China really want today.
I think that our report is an effort, at least on the American side, to identify what our national interest really is. And I think the same question, of course, applies to China. And I think until both countries do have some realistic assessment of what their real national interests are, it's going to be very difficult for us to heal this relationship. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank all of my fellow task forcers, and I hope you've enjoyed the morning. Thank you.